So what if the greatest sign that a civilization is about to, like, completely collapse is actually that it has never been richer?
Oh, wow. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Like, what if the absolute peak of a society's wealth, its massive demographic growth, its towering architecture, and all that cultural dominance, what if those aren't indicators of success at all?
Yeah, what if they're the symptoms?
Exactly. What if they are actually the terminal symptoms of a fatal disease?
Well,
Welcome to the deep dive, everyone.
it's a profoundly unsettling thought, honestly,
Totally.
because we are so conditioned to measure the health of any human enterprise. I mean, whether it's a nation, a massive corporation, or a cultural movement, we measure it by its balance sheet.
Right, the numbers.
Yeah, if the numbers are going up, if the influence is expanding, we just naturally assume the underlying structure is sound.
Yeah.
We equate prosperity with validation.
We really do. But the diagnostic manual we are looking at today fundamentally flips that entire assumption right on its head.
It really does.
So, today we are exploring a text that is thousands of years old. We're looking at Surah Al-Mu'minun,
Yeah.
specifically chapter 23, verses 50 through 56 of the Quran.
And we need to stress this, we aren't reading this as mystical poetry.
No, not at all. Or like a theological rule book either. We are looking at it through the highly analytical, really structural lens of the scholar Ghulam Ahmad Parwez.
Right.
And when you apply his framework, you aren't sitting in some religious sermon. It's like you are sitting with a master sociologist,
Yeah.
Dissecting a literal blueprint for civilizational survival.
And crucially, a blueprint of civilizational death.
Yeah, that's the dark part.
Because Parwez' analysis strips away all that sentimentality that usually surrounds these texts. He approaches this specific passage as a clinical autopsy of human systems.
An autopsy. I love that word for that.
It really fits. It is an examination of how a unified, rational society shatters into competing monopolies and why those monopolies look incredibly vibrant right before they implode.
Which brings up a massive myth we really need to dismantle right out of the gate.
Oh, the tribalism myth.
Yes,
Yeah.
because when we look at history, or honestly, just look at our social media feeds today, we see humans constantly dividing themselves.
Constantly.
We splinter into these hyperpolarized political factions, niche internet subcultures, rival corporate ecosystems, warring religious denominations. And the standard, almost lazy explanation for this is just evolutionary psychology.
Right, people just shrug.
Exactly. They shrug and say, well, humans are tribal. We're pack animals,
Yep.
We naturally form an us and we naturally fight a them.
And then that is the ultimate sociological cop-out.
It totally is.
By labeling sectarianism and systemic fragmentation as just, quote-unquote, human nature, we sanitize it.
Right.
We treat it as a benign, organic quirk of our biology, like getting goosebumps when we're cold.
But according to the structural analysis of this text,
Yeah.
that assumption is just dead wrong.
Completely wrong.
This fracturing of a unified community into self-isolated competing echo chambers, it is not organic. It is an engineered failure. It is a terminal disease. And what makes this specific passage so brilliant is this jarring narrative pivot it makes to deliver the diagnosis.
The pivot is everything here. You have to look at the sequence of the text. So in verse 50, it introduces the figures of Jesus and his mother, Mary, stating that they were made a sign.
A sign, right.
Now, if you are familiar with standard religious literature, the introduction of a major prophetic figure usually signals a victory lap.
Oh, for sure. You expect a triumphant story about the victory of monotheism, the defeat of evil, the dawn of a golden age.
You expect the Hollywood ending.
Right. The arrow arrived, the truth was spoken, and everyone lived in a unified utopia.
But that is the exact opposite of what happens in the text.
Literally the opposite.
Immediately after introducing Jesus as a sign in verse 50, the very next verses 52 through 56, they drop this devastating, icy diagnosis of total civilizational fragmentation.
There's no triumph at all.
None whatsoever. The text essentially lays out the original design, saying, this is your community, one unified community, the Ummah Wahida, and I am your Lord, so be accountable to me.
Okay, sounds good so far.
Right. But then comes the drop. It says, but they tore their affair into pieces among themselves, every faction rejoicing in what it has.
Man. So this isn't a celebration of a win. It's an autopsy of a massive failure.
Exactly.
The text is examining the corpse of a civilization. The Ummah Wahida, which, in Parwez's framework, translates to a single human community living under one rational, equitable order, it's shattered. It completely broke apart.
And our goal today is to really examine the mechanics of that shatter.
Yeah, how does that actually happen?
Well, how do specific vested interest groups capture tiny fragments of a universal truth, build a fortress around them, and declare their little extracted shard to be the entire universe?
And then use it to build empires of exploitation.
Right. And perhaps most chillingly, we need to understand why the ultimate symptom of this civilizational death is self-satisfaction.
So to understand the mechanics of that, we have to look really closely at the language. Because in a lot of the standard, perhaps softer translations of verse 53, you will see the Arabic word zubaran translated simply as sects or factions or groups.
Which is so weak.
It is. It makes it sound like a voluntary association, like, I don't know, bunch of people at a community center decided to form different clubs.
Right, like you guys go play chess in that room, we'll play basketball in this room.
Exactly. And we'll all just respectfully disagree on what the best hobby is.
But that translation completely neuters the violence of the concept.
It really does.
Parwez's etymological analysis of the root word zuber is super critical here. This root does not describe a voluntary ground-up association.
Well,
It refers to pieces that have been violently severed or cut from a unified whole.
so it's not a club.
No, if you take a sledgehammer to a complex piece of machinery, the jagged shards of metal left on the floor, those are zuberin.
Wow. That fundamentally changes the paradigm. A club is something you actively build together. A shard is a piece of wreckage.
Exactly.
So these sects, these factions, aren't just groups of people with differing opinions. They are fractured pieces of a master operating system that has been totally destroyed.
Precisely. Imagine someone holding a single spark plug and claiming it is the entire automobile.
Right. Like, look at my car.
Yeah. And the text provides the exact sociological mechanism for how these fragments operate. It uses the phrase amaromanamhum, which translates to their affair between themselves.
They're fair between themselves, so they become entirely self-referential.
Yes, exactly. When a system shatters into zuberin, each fragmented sect begins to govern itself using only its extracted tiny portion of the original code.
Just a spark plug.
Just a spark plug. They take one valid principle, maybe it's the concept of charity or a specific method of prayer or even a singular historical grievance.
Okay.
They sever it from the broader ecosystem of accountability and they build a massive wall around it.
And inside that wall,
Inside that wall, Amrahum Burnhamhum, they only talk to each other. They only consume media generated by each other. They only validate each other.
wow.
They pretend that their isolated shard is a flawless, comprehensive operating system for all of human reality.
It's the architecture of an echo chamber, but like on a civilizational scale.
Yes.
I'm thinking about how this maps onto the modern internet, actually, because you look at how certain online communities splinter. You start with a broad platform where everyone is interacting.
Right.
Then a group fractures off into a highly specific subreddit or an invite-only Discord server. And over time, they develop their own jargon, their own internal logic, their own enemies.
They become completely insulated from outside data.
Totally. If you bring a piece of contradictory evidence into that space, it doesn't just fail to persuade them. The architecture of the space literally rejects it as a foreign contagion.
That is a perfect modern analog. The fragmentation creates this complete epistemological closure.
Yeah.
And that actually brings us to the most terrifying part of this diagnosis. Verse 53 concludes with a really chilling observation. Kulu hizbi maladahim farihun. Every party, every sect is delighted with what it possesses.
Because, I mean, if you are utterly thrilled with your tiny fragment, you have zero incentive to look at the person next to you and see what piece of the puzzle they are holding.
Exactly.
You've walled yourself off from the very concept of learning.
The word used here is farihun. And it is vital to understand that in this specific structural context, this is not innocent joy.
It's not happiness.
No, this is not the quiet contentment of someone who has found peace. This farihun is a deeply toxic self-satisfaction. It is the blinding arrogance of the echo chamber.
Because you cannot patch or upgrade an operating system if the users are delighted by the bugs.
That's a great way to put it. If you are entirely convinced that your isolated piece of wreckage is the flawless, complete truth, the system loses all ability to self-correct. This toxic delight is literally the paralysis of human progress. When a group looks at its narrow, exclusive ideology and feels a smug, deep-seated satisfaction, the ideological arteries have hardened.
The civilization is effectively dead. It just hasn't stopped breathing yet.
Exactly.
But, this naturally begs the question. If the system is currently lying on the floor in 1,000 pieces, and everyone is standing around holding a shard and cheering, What was the original system supposed to look like?
What was the unified whole?
Right. What did the sledgehammer actually break? When the text talks about the Ummah Wahida, this unified community, it's so easy to fall into the trap of misty-eyed nostalgia.
Oh, very much so.
You hear people talk about it like, oh, once upon a time, humanity was one big happy family living in perfect harmony, and hopefully one day we'll hold hands and get back to that.
And Parwez is uncompromising on this point. The Ummah Wahida is neither historical nostalgia nor a naive utopian fantasy.
Okay, so what is it?
It is a strict clinical design specification. The text isn't weeping over a lost golden age. It is laying out the minimum viable requirements for a functional human community to survive without cannibalizing itself.
So it's an engineering spec.
Exactly. And the foundational requirement of this design spec is a single framework of accountability, which the text refers to as Rubiya.
Let's drill down into Rubiya,
Yeah.
because honestly, words like accountability can sound like corporate buzzwords.
They really can't.
What does a single framework of accountability actually look like in the mechanics of a real society?
Well, it means there is one universal system of provision, justice, and governance that applies to every human being equally, without exception.
Okay.
It means the absolute eradication of multiple competing sovereign claims.
Wait, expand on that. What do you mean by competing sovereign claims?
So in a fractured society, you have the elites operating under one set of rules where, say, white-collar crime results in a fine, and the marginalized operating under another, where a minor infraction ruins a life.
Right, we see that all the time.
Or you have one sect claiming a divine mandate to oppress another sect based on an exclusive set of laws. Rububiyya demands a single rational order.
But doesn't a single universal framework imply a kind of terrifying uniformity?
How so?
Well, if everyone is under the exact same order, does that mean everyone has to look the same, speak the same, live exactly the same way? Because that sounds less like a unified community and more like a totalitarian dystopia.
And that is where the brilliance of the architectural design comes in. The Ummah Wahida requires absolute, unbending unity in principle, but it permits incredibly wide variation in method.
Principle versus method. Okay, think of a modern supply chain maybe.
Yeah, let's use that.
The principle is that a package needs to get from a warehouse in Tokyo to a doorstep in London, intact and on time. That principle is absolute.
Right.
But the method, you might go on a cargo ship, then a freight train, then an electric delivery van, or maybe, a bicycle courier for the last mile. The methods are highly adaptable to the geography, the technology of the era, the local infrastructure. But if you lose the underlying principle, like if the ship captain decides he owns the cargo, or the train driver decides to go to Moscow instead, the entire system fails.
That is a highly accurate way to visualize it. So in the context of society, the permanent principle is equity. Every human being must have access to the resources required for their physical and intellectual development.
That's the baseline.
Yes. The method of how you distribute those resources, whether you design a specific progressive tax code, a universal basic income, a cooperative market model, or a state welfare system, that must vary based on the century, the geography, and the available technology.
Right. A method from 1,000 years ago won't work today.
Exactly. The problem, the root of the shatter, arises when human beings take a temporary method, declare it a permanent divine principle, and then go to war over it.
Oh, wow. So they freeze the method in time.
Yeah.
And who actually benefits from doing that? If the original design spec was this rational, adaptable, unified framework of equitable laws, what broke it?
That's the key question.
Because it wasn't just average people having innocent disagreements over how to distribute grain. The source material introduces a deeply cynical but historically flawless concept here. It argues that the fracturing into sects was caused by the formation of vested interests.
Yes. Theological disagreement is almost always the smokescreen.
Always.
The actual root of fragmentation is elite capture. The text specifically identifies the class responsible for this systemic fracture. The religious elites, the Abar and the Reuben.
The scholars and the priests.
The institutional gatekeepers.
So how exactly does that elite capture work? What is the actual mechanism they use?
It is a chillingly predictable sociological process. A group of intellectuals or clerics realizes that a truly unified, equitable system, the Ummah Wahida, leaves absolutely no room for middlemen. In a system of universal equity and direct accountability, no one can claim exclusive access to truth or resources. You can't charge a toll on a road that belongs to everyone.
It's just open.
Exactly. So what do the elites do? They extract a piece of the code, they take a zuber, a fragment, and they install it as their exclusive intellectual property.
They build a monopoly over the truth.
They do.
I'm thinking about the mechanics of how you actually pull that off in the real world. Historically, one of the easiest ways is through language and literacy.
Oh, absolutely.
You make sure the sacred texts or the legal codes are only available in a language the average person doesn't speak, like Latin in medieval Europe or highly complex legalistic Arabic.
Right, you lock it behind a linguistic wall.
Yeah, you invented dense, impenetrable jargon, you create an artificial barrier to entry, and then you offer your services as the only authorized translator.
Exactly. You manufacture an artificial scarcity of knowledge. And once they have established that monopoly, the source text says they begin consuming people's wealth falsely.
False.
Yes. They become literal roadblocks on the path of human progress. They block the road so they can charge a toll.
The source actually outlines this as the industry of religion, and it reads like a predatory business plan.
It really does.
These gatekeepers manufacture highly complex rituals that only they have the credentials to perform. They monetize blessings. They sell amulets, or tawiz. They sell the forgiveness of sins.
It's highly lucrative.
From a purely cynical economic perspective, it is a flawless business model. The overhead is virtually zero. You don't need supply chains or factories. The only raw material required is human ignorance and fear.
And you enforce this monopoly through social terror.
Wow. Yeah.
If someone questions the toll booth, the elites don't just say, oh, we disagree with your economic analysis.
No, they don't debate you.
They excommunicate you. They declare you a heretic, an outcast. They use the threat of divine punishment to protect their market share.
It's exactly like digital rights management DRM on modern software.
Oh, that's a brilliant comparison.
Think about it. You buy a car, the hardware is sitting right there in your driveway, but the manufacturer puts a software lock on the heated seats.
Right, you have the seats, but they don't work.
Exactly. You have to pay a monthly subscription fee just to access something you already physically possess.
Yes.
The religious elites put DRM on basic human access to reality. They say, you want peace. You want salvation. You want to understand your place in the universe. You have to pay the subscription fee to our specific sect. You must submit to our hierarchy and buy our specific rituals.
And this brings us to a crucial historical case study provided in the text.
Oh, this is the best part.
It really is. To see exactly how this systemic capture plays out in real time, the source takes us back to the figure mentioned in the opening verse.
Jesus.
Jesus of Nazareth.
Yes. It frames his life not as a theological debate, but as a violent collision between a systems disruptor and the ultimate religious monopoly of the first century. Right, let's look at the sociology of this threat. Jesus walks into the temple in Jerusalem. Now, we have to strip away the stained glass window version of this story.
We really do.
We have to understand the temple not just as a quiet place of prayer, but as the literal Wall Street of its era.
It was a massive financial hub.
It was the absolute center of elite power, wealth extraction, and the religious industry.
It was a macroeconomic engine. Consider the mechanics of it. Every adult male was required to pay a half-shekel temple tax.
Okay.
But you couldn't pay it in standard Roman currency because it bore the image of the emperor. You had to exchange it for Tyrian shekels.
So there's a conversion.
Yes, and the elites set up currency exchange tables and charged exorbitant exchange rates.
Of course they did.
Then there was the monopoly on sacrifices. You had to offer an unblemished animal. You could bring your own dove from home, but the temple inspectors, who were part of the elite class, would almost certainly find a blemish.
So they reject your animal.
Exactly. And force you to buy one of their pre-approved, massively marked up animals.
It's a closed loop.
Completely closed. It was a closed-loop system of wealth extraction controlled entirely by the Abar and Reuben of that time, the Pharisees and Sadducees.
And Jesus walks right into the center of this financial engine.
Yeah, he does.
He doesn't sit down and politely debate the nuances of Scripture with them. He physically disrupts the currency exchanges.
It flips the tables.
He critiques their architecture of corruption. He famously calls them blind guides and whitewashed tombs. I always found that image so striking. Beautiful, pristine, and gleaming white on the outside, but inside, completely full of dead men's bones and rotting decay.
He specifically indicts them for the exact crime of gatekeeping we just discussed. He tells them, you shut the doors to the system in people's faces, you refuse to enter yourselves, and you block anyone else who tries to enter.
The DRM?
Yes. They are the monopolists who have locked the gate of the Ummah Wahida and thrown away the key simply to maintain their profit margins.
But, how did these elites get away with this? Why didn't the masses just revolt? Or why didn't the ruling superpower of the day, Rome, shut them down?
That is the big question.
This is where the source provides a brilliant piece of political economy analysis. The elites didn't just stumble into this power. They pulled off a masterful, deeply cynical political maneuver. They made a pact with the Roman Empire.
And this pact is the key to understanding how fragmented systems survive for centuries.
It really is.
The religious elites of the temple knew they could never defeat the Roman military machine, so they negotiated a compromise.
A deal with the devil, basically.
Pretty much. They went to the Roman prefects and essentially said, look, we will not challenge your political dominance, we won't interfere with your taxation of the provinces, and we won't challenge your military control.
Okay, and in return?
In exchange, give us absolute, unquestioned autonomy over personal laws, marriages, divorces, rituals, and the day-to-day social control of the masses.
Man, so they accepted total political subservience to a foreign empire in exchange for a total religious and social monopoly over their own people.
Exactly.
They basically said, you take the state and the military. We'll take the minds and the wallets of the flock.
And Rome accepted this deal eagerly.
Why wouldn't they?
Because the religious elites functioned as the perfect pacifiers. They kept the population docile.
Right.
I mean, if the masses are obsessed with minute, hyper-specific debates about the exact length of a beard, or the precise way to wash their hands before a meal, or the exact phrasing of a prayer...
They aren't looking at the Romans.
Exactly. They are not organizing a rebellion against the structural oppression of the Roman state. The elites became the middle managers of oppression. They diverted the revolutionary energy of the people into harmless internal sectarian squabbles.
So when you view Jesus through this sociological framework, you suddenly understand exactly why the elites were so desperate to eliminate him.
It makes total sense.
It had nothing to do with being offended by his theology. It was entirely about self-preservation. It was about livelihood.
He was an existential threat to the business model.
Yes.
If Jesus succeeded in his mission, which was to bypass the gatekeepers, shatter the sectarian monopolies, and reestablish a unified, egalitarian system based on direct accountability, the elites would lose everything.
Everything.
Their entire machinery of selling access to God, of monetizing rituals, of charging exchange rates on salvation, it would evaporate overnight.
And the political fallout would be catastrophic for them, too. If the masses actually unified into a single, rational community, they would become a massive political threat to Rome.
A huge threat.
The Roman authorities would look at the temple elites and say, we gave you this monopoly to keep these people divided and docile. You failed.
And then Rome would crush them.
Exactly. The Romans would crush the elites. So Jesus wasn't just a theological rogue. He was a rogue variable in a carefully managed algorithm of socioeconomic control. They had to eliminate him to protect the pact.
And they did, or at least they successfully defended their fragmented, exploitative system for a time. The monopolies survived.
They did.
But this leads us to what is perhaps the most counterintuitive, mind-bending concept in the entire source text.
I know exactly where you're going with this.
Because when you observe these deeply corrupt, fragmented systems, these empires built entirely on false monopolies, wealth extraction, and political compromises, they don't usually look like failing states.
No, they don't.
For long periods of time, they look incredibly, undeniably prosperous. How does a fundamentally broken system manage to survive and look so successful?
That brings up the concept of mukafati amal, the law of requital.
The law of requital.
This is where the ancient diagnosis becomes unnervingly relevant to our modern world. Let me read verses 55 and 56 from chapter 23, which set up this law. The text says, "Do they think that because we give them wealth and children, we are hastening to them good things? No, they do not perceive."
The irony dripping from these verses is devastating.
It really is.
Imagine one of these highly fragmented systems, a sect, or a massive corporate monopoly, or a corrupt political machine. They've successfully captured a piece of the code, walled it off, and monetized it perfectly.
Right.
Over decades or centuries, what is the natural result? They accumulate staggering wealth, their bank accounts swell, their demographics explode. The text mentions children, which signifies numerical growth, followers, market share.
Yeah, it get massive.
They acquire vast political power and cultural dominance.
And when the leaders of that fragmented system look around at their sprawling compounds, their massive bank balances, and their millions of followers, what do they naturally conclude?
They read the balance sheet as divine validation.
Of course they do.
They say to themselves, look at our unimaginable wealth, look at our power. Clearly, God or the invisible hand of the market or the arc of history is on our side.
Right.
Clearly, our tiny fragment of the truth is actually the absolute correct whole. Our prosperity is proof of our righteousness.
It is the ultimate prosperity gospel applied to civilizational survival. Like, we are winning the game, therefore our rules must be the right ones.
Exactly.
But the text cuts right through that delusion. It says, no, they do not perceive. What exactly is the blindness here? What are they failing to perceive?
They are completely blind to the law of requital. In a fragmented, exploitative system, the accumulation of wealth is not a sign of structural soundness.
Wait, say that again?
It is the ultimate indicator of the final stage before total collapse.
I really want to make sure this lands. You are saying that massive prosperity is actually a symptom of collapse.
Yes. Because in a fundamentally broken system, accumulated resources do not solve the underlying decay. They merely mask the accumulated structural errors.
Mask the errors.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, let me try an analogy. Think of a massive skyscraper built on a fundamentally flawed, rotting foundation.
Okay, good visual.
As the building starts to lean, the owners don't tear it down and pour concrete. That would mean admitting failure. Instead, they just throw staggering amounts of money at the visual problem.
Right.
They buy expensive gold struts to prop up the leaning walls. They hire elite PR firms to convince the public that the lean is actually a cutting-edge architectural feature.
Oh, definitely.
They bring in more and more high-paying tenants to generate the rent needed to buy more gold struts. From the outside, the building looks incredibly opulent. It is driven in wealth and activity.
But the foundation is still rotting.
Exactly. The core structural integrity is still decaying. The opulence is just hiding the rot. And the heavier the building gets with all that accumulated wealth and population, the more catastrophic the kinetic energy of the final collapse will be.
Yes.
The system looks the most prosperous, the most heavy with resources, right before it breaks under the weight of its own contradictions.
That is the exact mechanical reality of a corrupt civilization. The system looks most opulent right before the shatter.
Right.
And Parwez highlights how the source material provides a granular economic example of how this opulence is generated through systemic manipulation.
Let's hear it.
It shows how the elites manipulate the legal code to make raw exploitation look like lawful, divine prosperity.
The example in the text revolves around the agricultural economy, right?
Yeah.
Specifically, the relationship between a poor farmer and an elite landowner.
Yes.
The elite landowner does absolutely zero physical labor. He doesn't plant the seeds, he doesn't water the crops, he doesn't harvest. But through a rigged legal system, he extracts 50% or more of the farmer's yield.
Right.
Now, if the landowner just rode up on a horse with a sword and took half the grain, everyone would recognize it as violent theft. The system would identify it as a crime.
But the elite doesn't use a sword. He uses a legal loophole.
Exactly.
He controls the definitions. He renames the exploitation. He drafts a contract and calls it a legitimate business partnership.
A partnership. Wow.
He claims that because he holds the ancestral deed to the land, he is legally entitled to half the labor of the man working it.
He rebrands theft as synergy.
He totally does.
And meanwhile, if a reformer comes along and suggests an actually equitable model, like a true cooperative, where the laborer retains the full value of their work and the land is managed collectively, what happens?
The elites freak out.
The elites will immediately mobilize their legal and religious machinery to falsely decry the reformer. They will label the equitable model as unlawful, heretical, or a threat to social order.
Right.
They change the labels. They call theft partnership and they call equity rebellion. By completely controlling the definitions of right and wrong, they keep the wealth flowing upward without ever triggering an immediate violent revolt.
And as that wealth relentlessly flows upward, the elite class gets richer, their institutions get larger, their specific sect looks more culturally powerful.
And they point to it.
Yes, they point to that very stolen wealth as proof of their divine correctness. It is a perfectly closed-loop system of self-delusion.
It's terrifying.
But Parwez doesn't just leave us with an abstract economic model. He provides what I consider to be one of the most haunting, brilliant analogies in all of sociological literature for this concept of terminal prosperity.
Oh, the Krishna analogy.
The analogy of the kushta.
We have to spend some time on the Krishna. Because once you understand this metaphor, you will see it everywhere in the modern world.
You really will.
In traditional Eastern medicine, okushta is an elixir. It is a highly potent, often very dangerous concoction that physicians would mix, and it frequently contained highly toxic heavy metals like arsenic.
And it was almost exclusively used as an absolute last resort.
Right. So imagine a patient lying in a bed. They are in the final stages of a terminal illness. Their internal organs are failing, their skin is pale and ashen, they are wasting away.
Okay.
The traditional physician examines them, knows that death is imminent, and as a final desperate measure administers the kushta.
The arsenic.
Yes. Now, because this elixir contains a powerful toxin, it triggers a massive, violent physiological reaction in the dying body. The poison causes the blood vessels to rapidly dilate.
Oh, wow.
Suddenly, the dying patient's cheeks flush with a deep, vibrant, rosy red. Their eyes might open wide. Their breathing might suddenly quicken. For a brief, fleeting moment, they look incredibly energized.
And imagine the family standing around the bed. They don't understand the underlying chemistry of what is happening.
They just see the flush.
Right. They see this sudden flush of color and they rejoice. They throw their hands up and say, look, the medicine worked. The color has returned to his face. He is cured. He is full of vitality.
But the physician standing in the corner knows the grim truth.
Yes.
That flush of color is not a return to health. It is the literal physical symptom of the poison finally overwhelming the system and shutting down the organs.
Terrific.
It is the body's last desperate flare of kinetic energy before total system failure. The flush of the kushta is the mask of death wearing the face of vitality.
And this, Parwez argues, is the exact diagnostic reality of a corrupt, fragmented civilization.
Let that sink in.
When a society permanently abandons the blueprint of the Ummah Wahida, when it abandons universal equity, direct accountability, and justice, and instead willfully fragments into warring sects dedicated to elite wealth extraction, it is drinking the kushta.
It is ingesting systemic poison.
Yes.
But the poison doesn't kill the society immediately. That's the trap.
No, it does the opposite in the short term. The poison generates immense wealth. It generates empire.
Right.
It fuels massive technological innovation driven by competition and explosive demographic expansion. The society gets a sudden, unnatural flush of red in its cheeks.
The GDP skyrockets.
Exactly. The stock market hits record highs. The skyscrapers touch the clouds. The military expands its footprint globally.
And the elites look at it and cheer.
The elites look at this incredible chart of upward growth and they rejoice, declaring we are the greatest, most robust civilization in human history. Look at our vitality.
Look at modern economics. Seriously. How often do we see the financial kushta administered?
All the time.
Think about quantitative easing or pumping massive amounts of venture capital into a fundamentally broken tech startup.
Oh, that's a perfect example.
The company has a terrible business model. It loses money on every transaction, but VC money floods in. Suddenly, they have beautiful offices, thousands of employees, massive market share.
They look like a unicorn.
They look like a unicorn, everyone celebrates, but the core unit economics are rotting. The VC money is just the arsenic dilating the blood vessels before the inevitable bankruptcy.
Exactly.
The prosperity of a corrupt society is exactly the flush of the kushta before death.
So, if the flush of sectarian prosperity is actually a death sentence, if being rich and powerful while being fundamentally fragmented and inequitable just means you are in the terminal stage of the disease, where does that leave humanity?
Good question.
Where does that leave the original mission to build a unified system? This brings us to the synthesis of the entire deep dive, the architecture of tomorrow.
We have to bring this full circle right back to the very opening verse that triggered this whole analysis. Verse 23.50, Jesus and Mary as a sign.
Right.
We established earlier that this wasn't a sign of triumphant, happily ever after victory, but a sign preceding an autopsy.
Yeah.
But why choose Jesus specifically as the pivot point for this diagnosis?
Because Parwez synthesizes the overarching historical narrative here. By introducing Jesus not as a mystical, ethereal figure floating above history, but as a specific grounded instance of a recurring mission, the text is revealing a permanent pattern.
A permanent pattern, okay.
The mission to restore the Ummah Wahida from its shattered state is a permanent, recurring requirement of human history. Jesus was attempting to reboot the operating system back to its original design spec of accountability and equity, fighting directly against the vested interests of his time.
But here is the supreme tragic irony that the text is highlighting.
Yes.
Jesus executes this anti-sectarian, anti-monopoly mission. He is eliminated by the state and the temple.
Yeah.
And yet, what happens next?
It's tragic.
The very community that arose in his name, claiming to carry his legacy, eventually became the most dramatically fragmented civilization in human history.
Yes.
The followers of the man who tried to destroy the temple monopolies eventually split into thousands and thousands of distinct denominations, sects, and factions. And each of those factions was fiercely at war with the others, each claiming to hold the exclusive fragment of truth.
They became the Zubarim.
The violently cut pieces.
Exactly. They replicated the exact system of the Pharisees that their founder had tried to dismantle. They built massive, wealthy religious monopolies.
Right.
They allied with secular empires like the pact with Constantine and the Roman state. And they created entirely new classes of Abar and Reuben to consume people's wealth falsely.
And the irony is compounding, honestly. Because the source text points out that later, Islamic civilizations, despite having this exact Quranic warning literally spelled out for them in these very verses, inherited and replicated this exact same fatal pattern.
They did.
They shattered into sects, they formed religious monopolies, they allied with corrupt political powers, and they sat back, utterly delighted with their fragments. The disease of the kushta is incredibly contagious.
It is a universal pattern of institutional decay. Which means the permanent question left for humanity is fundamentally misunderstood by almost everyone.
What do you mean?
People spend their entire lives engaged in bitter theological or ideological debates over which sect is right, which political party holds the true essence of freedom, which religious fragment has the correct interpretation.
We spend all our energy arguing, is my jagged shard of glass shinier and better than your jagged shard of glass?
Exactly. And it is a completely meaningless debate.
Meaningless.
Because they are all governing by broken shards. A shard, even if it reflects a tiny piece of the light perfectly, is still part of a shattered system. It cannot sustain civilizational life.
Wow.
The actual question we must face is not theological, it is architectural.
If the code has been shattered for thousands of years, if every time a disruptor comes along and tries to unify us, the vested interests eventually co-opt the movement, monetize it, and shatter it again, is it even possible to put the pieces back together?
That's the challenge.
Are we just trying to glue a shattered vase back into its original shape, which seems impossible? Or do we need to write an entirely new operating system from scratch?
It is the critical question for the next generation. And based on Parwez's reading, the answer is that the core principles, the rububiyah, the absolute requirement for universal accountability, equity, and a single rational order, those principles remain perfectly intact.
So the principles are fine.
They are the laws of social physics. You don't rewrite them. You can't invent a new physics of gravity just because your airplane crashed.
I like that.
What must be redesigned from scratch is the human architecture built to navigate those laws.
The institutional framework has to change.
Yes. The failure has always been in the human architecture allowing vested interests to take root. Every time a unified system is established, we have failed to build adequate fail-safes against elite capture.
We always let the gatekeepers back in.
We allow new gatekeepers to emerge. We allow new monopolies to form over knowledge, over resources, over political power.
Right.
The challenge for the future is to design socioeconomic and political architectures that actively prevent the Abar and Reuben the monopolists, whether they wear religious robes, judicial wigs, or corporate suits, from capturing the code and shattering the system into Zubarin again.
We have to design an architecture that makes the echo chamber mathematically impossible.
Exactly.
An architecture that makes that toxic delight, the fairy hunt, impossible. Because the system itself demands constant iteration, constant learning, constant equity, and unbending accountability.
That is the permanent mission, and it requires stripping away the sentimentality, the historical nostalgia, and the self-righteousness, and looking at our societies with the cold, clear eyes of a systems engineer diagnosing a structural flaw.
And that brings this entire autopsy directly to you. Because this analysis of Surah al-Mu'minun isn't just a critique of ancient history or dead religious institutions.
No, not at all.
It is a live diagnostic tool for the reality you are living in right this second. When you look around at our modern world, when you look at our hyperpolarized political echo chambers, our socioeconomic divisions, our algorithmic factions on the internet where everyone is violently separated into warring camps based on engagement metrics, ask yourself, are we just governing ourselves by our own little extracted fragments of the code?
Are we just engaged in Amarhum Benamhum? Are we only talking to ourselves, only validating our own narrow shards of reality while ignoring the complete operating system?
And more importantly, are we infected with that toxic delight? Are we so arrogantly satisfied with our own shattered pieces of the truth that we have lost the ability to upgrade, to learn, and to unify?
This is a scary thought.
Have we become the roadblocks on the path of progress, while remaining entirely convinced that we are the guides?
It is the ultimate test of self-awareness for any civilization. And I want to leave you with one final provocative thought to mull over, building on everything we've unpacked today.
Let's hear it.
The next time you see a massive institution, whether it is a trillion-dollar tech monopoly, a seemingly unstoppable political movement, or a massive cultural wave, and you see them boasting about their unimaginable wealth, their exponential growth, and their absolute dominance over the landscape, don't just reflexively accept that prosperity as validation.
Look closer.
Ask yourself, are you really looking at a thriving, unified, equitable system? Or are you just looking at the flesh of the kushta right before the collapse?
The opulence of the terminal diagnosis. Suddenly, that diagnostic landscape doesn't seem so murky after all. We just had to learn how to identify the shadows. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive into the source material. We will see you next time.